She sat in that booth for 2.5 hours before she finally accepted that he wasn't coming. Not late, not stuck in traffic, not anything that a reasonable excuse could fix. Just gone, as if the last 6 weeks of morning texts and late-night phone calls and one very specific conversation about how he preferred women who were real, not runway, had never happened at all. Wren Calloway had worn the burgundy dress. That was the part that kept circling back to her, quiet and humiliating, like a song she couldn't stop hearing. The burgundy dress had been hanging in her closet for 11 months, tags still on, purchased on an impulse after a particularly brutal day at the office, when she'd walked past a boutique window and seen it on a mannequin and thought, someday. She had tried it on in the dressing room, turned sideways in the mirror, and decided that maybe someday was still a ways off. The fabric pulled slightly at the hips, not badly, but enough that she noticed. She'd bought it anyway, and tonight she'd finally worn it. Because Owen Latimer had spent 6 weeks telling her that the way she filled a room was the most magnetic thing he'd ever encountered in a woman, and she had been stupid enough to believe him. The restaurant was called Ardennes, and it occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. The kind of place where the bread arrived warm in a linen-lined basket, and the lighting was specifically engineered to make everyone look like they were being gently lit by candlelight. Wren had looked up the menu online after Owen suggested it. The cheapest entree was $62. She had worn the burgundy dress, taken a cab instead of the subway so she wouldn't arrive with wind-ruined hair, and she had sat at the table he'd reserved under his name at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night. It was now 10:19. Their waiter, a young man named Patrick, who had the particular kind of professionally sympathetic face that Wren suspected he reserved for people dining alone, had refilled her sparkling water 4 times without being asked. She appreciated it and hated it equally. She'd sent Owen 3 messages across the first hour, the first cheerful, the second more neutral, the third simply, "Hey, is everything okay?" 3 blue ticks. He'd read them, he just hadn't answered. Wren looked down at her phone one last time and then turned the screen face down on the tablecloth. She was a forensic accountant at a mid-sized firm in Chelsea. She spent her professional life finding the precise moment where numbers stopped telling the truth, and she was very good at it. She understood, in a purely analytical sense, that being stood up by a man she'd met on an app was not a reflection of her worth as a human being. She understood that. The understanding didn't help at all. She reached for her coat on the hook beside the booth and started to gather her things. She would not cry here. She would get into an elevator, descend 42 floors, walk out onto Fifth Avenue, and she would cry in the cab. She had a system. She was reaching for her purse strap when the lights in the restaurant went out. Not all of them. The ambient lighting held, the soft golden glow of the engineered ambiance, but the overhead fixtures, the kitchen pass-through lights, the subtle downlights above the bar, all of them cut simultaneously, replaced a half-second later by the sharp white hum of emergency lighting along the floor. The restaurant's background music, something low and jazz-adjacent that Wren had barely registered, died mid-note. The effect on the room was immediate and physical. 60-odd diners went very, very quiet. The maitre d', a silver-haired man who had looked down the length of his considerable nose at Wren when she'd arrived alone, and clarified twice that she was expecting someone, was now standing motionless near the host stand with both hands flat against his sides and the color entirely gone from his face. 4 men walked in from the elevator bank. They were dressed well. Dark suits, no ties, the particular cut of jackets that didn't quite drape correctly because of what was worn beneath them. They moved like water finding a drain, smooth, deliberate, inevitable. They didn't look at the diners. They looked at the room's geometry, its exits, its sightlines, and then the man behind them walked in, and Wren understood why everyone had gone so still. He was tall, not excessively so, but built in a way that made the space around him seem slightly smaller, like a room accommodating something it wasn't quite designed to hold. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides, and his face was the kind of face that belonged in old portraiture. Strong jaw, slightly crooked nose that had been broken at least once and left to heal without much intervention. Deep-set eyes the color of aged pewter. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression that contained approximately 0 emotion, and he moved through the room like he owned it, which, Wren would learn later, was not entirely a metaphor. His name was Soren Vance. She knew it the way anyone in New York with half a functioning brain and access to a newspaper knew it. He was the kind of name that appeared in Page 6 only in the context of what he'd allegedly done to people who crossed him, and in the Metro section only in the context of charges that somehow never reached trial. He was 41 years old and he ran an organization that had its fingers in shipping, in real estate, in private security, and in at least 4 other industries that no one discussed aloud. The FBI had opened and closed a file on Soren Vance twice in the last decade. Both times, the key witnesses had experienced a sudden and collective change of heart about their willingness to testify. One of his men stepped forward. His voice was very calm and very loud. "Our den is closed for the evening. Private event. Please leave your meals, exit through the service corridor at the rear of the kitchen, and do not use your phones until you have reached the street level." He paused. "Thank you for your cooperation." What followed was not quite a stampede, but was adjacent to one. Wren watched, slightly stunned, as the restaurant emptied itself with remarkable speed. No one argued. No one asked about their check. A woman in a white blazer left a full glass of Barolo on the table without looking back at it. The couple nearest Wren's booth knocked over a bread basket in their hurry, and neither of them stopped to right it. Patrick the waiter gave Wren one single wide-eyed look before he was gently but very firmly herded toward the kitchen by one of Soren Vance's men. Wren did not move. This was partly shock, partly the specific paralysis of a body that had received too many competing signals at once, and could not decide which one to act on. But by the time she had talked herself into standing, the room was already empty, and all 4 men in dark suits were positioned at intervals around the perimeter like load-bearing walls. Soren Vance was looking at her, not scanning the room and landing on her incidentally, looking at her directly and with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had already decided she was the most interesting problem in the space. He walked toward her table. Up close, he smelled of cedar and something colder beneath it, clean and metallic, the way the air smelled before a storm moved in off the water. He stopped at the edge of her booth and looked down at her with those storm-grey eyes, and said nothing for a moment that lasted approximately 1 geological era. Then, "You're Wren Calloway." It wasn't a question. Wren's mouth opened and then closed. Her heart was doing something loud and unhelpful in her chest. Yes. You do forensic accounting for Hargrove and Associates." He said it the way someone reads a file, factual, unhurried. "You've been at that table since 8 o'clock. "I had a reservation," Wren said, because it was the only sentence she could locate. "I was waiting for someone." Soren Vance pulled out the chair across from her. Owen's chair, the chair that had sat empty for 2.5 hours, and sat down in it with the casual authority of a man who had never in his adult life encountered a space he wasn't entitled to occupy. "Owen Latimer," he said. The name hit Wren like cold water. "You know Owen?" "I did." His voice was even. "Until approximately 72 hours ago, when I discovered that someone had been running a secondary ledger through one of my holding companies for the past 14 months, redirecting wire transfers, small enough amounts that the variance looked like rounding error, large enough that at volume it comes out to just over $6 million. Wren stared at him. "Mr. Latimer," Soren continued, "was employed as a financial consultant for one of my legitimate subsidiaries. He had access to the shell layers. He understood how the money moved." He tilted his head slightly. "He told my associates when we located him this afternoon that he was meeting his partner here tonight, a woman named Calloway. He told them she was holding the documentation on the offshore accounts." The silence in the room felt like a physical object. Wren heard what he was saying. She was very good at following numerical logic, and she understood, with horrible clarity, the structure of what was being described. Owen hadn't stood her up. Owen had used her. 6 weeks of being carefully, specifically made to feel seen. The texts, the calls, the "I love a woman with substance," all of it calibrated to place her in this restaurant at this time, a visible, credible, sympathetic decoy. Someone who looked like a nervous first date waiting for her moment, not like a criminal, not like someone who should be searched. The perfect prop. The fury that moved through Wren was so sudden and so complete that it briefly cancelled out the terror entirely. "That," she said, her voice remarkably steady, "absolute piece of garbage." Soren Vance blinked. It was the smallest possible version of surprise, barely a shift in the architecture of his face, but she caught it. "He spent 6 weeks," Wren continued, and she could feel her hands shaking now, not with fear but with the kind of anger that lives in the sternum and radiates outward, "sending me good morning texts. He asked me what my favorite season was. He remembered that I don't like cilantro. She was aware she was telling a mafia boss about cilantro and could not stop herself. I took half a day off work to get my hair done. I wore a dress that I bought a year ago because I wasn't sure I could pull it off, and I sat at that table for 2.5 hours convincing myself that something must have come up, that he was going to walk through that door, that I had not been a complete and catastrophic idiot. She pressed her palms flat against the tablecloth. I don't have your money, Mr. Vance. I don't have any documentation. I'm a forensic accountant who does compliance work for dental groups and mid-market logistics companies, and I met Owen Latimer on Hinge because his profile said he liked hiking and long dinners, and I am apparently very, very stupid. The words came out before she could qualify them, and she regretted the last part immediately, not because it wasn't true, but because she'd said it out loud to a person who terrified her. Soren was quiet for a moment. He looked at her, not the way the matron had looked at her when she arrived alone, not the way Patrick had looked at her with that careful professional pity. He looked at her the way she looked at a set of numbers that didn't add up yet, but were starting to. Nico, he said without looking away from her. One of the suited men materialized at the edge of the table. Boss, she's clean. I can see that. A pause. You want us to move on, Latimer? I want you to find him first. Soren stood buttoning the single button of his jacket with 2 precise movements. He looked back down at Wren. Come with me. I'm sorry? Latimer named you as his associate. Whether that was strategic misdirection or not, the information is already circulating. His voice had a quality that Wren could only describe as inexorable. Not loud, not threatening in any theatrical sense, just completely, structurally immovable. There are people in this city who are owed money by the same man who just spent 6 weeks establishing a documented connection between himself and you. They will find that connection. And they will not ask as politely as I did. Wren looked at him. She looked at the empty restaurant. She looked at the 4 men positioned like cornerstones around the room. You could just let me call the police, she said. Soren's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted, the way a landscape shifts when a cloud passes over it. The detective who would take that call has dinner at my table every 3rd Tuesday, he said. Mrs. Calloway, I'm not giving you a choice because I enjoy taking them from people. I'm giving you a choice because there is one. Come with me, and I will make sure nothing touches you. Walk out that door alone, and I cannot promise the same. Wren stood up. Her legs worked, which surprised her. Fine, she said, picking up her coat and her purse with hands that were no longer shaking. Not because she wasn't scared, but because the anger had settled into something harder and more useful than fear. But I want it on record that this is the worst Thursday I have had in at least 4 years. Something moved in Soren Vance's eyes, not quite a smile. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as one. Noted, he said, and led her toward the elevator. His car was a black SUV with tinted windows, and the particular quality of interior silence that suggested the vehicle had been specifically engineered to contain whatever happened inside it. Wren sat rigid in the back seat, watching Midtown dissolve into the west side, then into a neighborhood she didn't immediately recognize, all converted warehouse facades and streets that weren't well lit enough to make her feel calm. They went underground into a private garage, an elevator, and then Wren stepped into a space that was so unlike what she'd expected that she briefly forgot to be afraid. It was warm. That was the first thing. The temperature was warm, and the light was warm, and the furniture was the kind of furniture that existed because someone had taste, rather than because someone had hired a decorator to project taste. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on the north wall. A kitchen that looked actually used. Windows facing the river, the city's lights reflecting off the water in long broken lines. Sit, Soren said, in the tone of someone who issued instructions without anticipating that they'd require negotiation. Wren sat on the edge of a charcoal sofa and wrapped her arms around herself. The burgundy dress, which had made her feel almost brave when she'd looked in the mirror 6 hours ago, now just felt like evidence of a very poor decision. How long do I have to stay here? She asked. Soren was at a bar cart, pouring 2 glasses of something amber without asking her preference. Until we locate Latimer and recover what he took. And if you don't... He crossed the room and handed her a glass. Their fingers didn't quite touch. We will. He settled into the armchair across from her with the specific ease of a man who occupied every space he entered with exactly the same amount of himself. He studied her in that methodical way, her face, the set of her shoulders, the way she was pressing her knees together. You're still angry, he observed. I'm always angry, Wren said. which was not entirely true but felt true at the moment. I've been sitting at that table composing a very articulate text about why I deserve better, and then deleting it for 2 hours. The Mafia showing up actually gave me something more productive to be angry about. Soren looked at her for a long moment. How long did you wait before you accepted he wasn't coming? About 90 minutes before I admitted it. 30 more minutes of bargaining, and then the last 20 minutes were just spite. She took a sip of the bourbon and felt it settle warm in her sternum. I'd already paid for the Spanx. I was committed. The corner of Soren Vance's mouth moved, infinitesimally. She filed it away. The elevator opened and Nico strode in, tablet in hand, expression tight. We've got a problem. Soren didn't move. Latimer isn't at any of his known addresses. His devices went dark at 9:15. We ran his financials. He liquidated his personal accounts yesterday morning. He's been planning this exit for at least 2 weeks, the offshore routing documentation, Soren said. He didn't have it on him when he ran? No physical drive. His apartment was clean, professionally wiped. He was careful. Nico hesitated. There's more. He's been in contact with Aldrich Sorel. Soren went very still. Wren didn't know that name, but she could read the air quality in the room the same way she could read a balance sheet. And something had just shifted significantly in the wrong direction. Sorel runs the East Coast receivables for the Marchetti network, Soren said quietly, to no one in particular. If Latimer sold them the routing codes, Nico started. He hasn't. Soren's voice was flat. Because if he had, we would already know it. The codes aren't moving yet, which means he hasn't delivered them. He looked at Nico, which means he still has them, or he's waiting to make the exchange in person. We can't find the codes. His hard drives were military wiped. Yes. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Wren. She had been listening with the focused, slightly airless attention of someone trying to understand the rules of a game midway through, and something in what they were saying had started pulling at a loose thread in her memory. Wait, she said. Both men looked at her. Wren reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She opened her messages and scrolled back to a thread from earlier that evening. Owen texted me at 7:15, she said, right before I left my apartment. He said he'd downloaded the menu in advance. Ardennes apparently has a digital sommelier interface for VIP reservations, and he said the maitre would want to verify it before seating me. She found the message. He sent me an attachment, a file. He texted 3 times asking if I'd opened it. Nico made a sound in Italian that was clearly not polite. Wren looked up. I tried to open it in the cab. My phone froze and I thought the file was corrupted. I figured it was just some app thing. She turned the phone so they could see the message. He was very specific about me downloading it before I arrived. Soren rose from the armchair and crossed the room in 3 unhurried strides. He didn't take her phone. He crouched down to her level instead, bracing one hand on the arm of the sofa, and looked at the screen. His face was very close to hers, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. He couldn't move the data through his own devices, Soren said slowly, because we were monitoring his digital footprint. He couldn't carry a physical drive because he knew we'd search him if we caught him before he reached the airport. He met her eyes. So he encrypted the routing codes and embedded them in a file, and he convinced a woman he'd been carefully grooming for 6 weeks to carry it through the door of a restaurant he knew I'd be watching, on the one night he planned to disappear. The silence in the room was absolute. Wren thought about 6 weeks of good morning texts. She thought about the conversation where Owen had asked her, very casually, whether she backed up her phone to the cloud automatically or manually. She thought about how he'd laughed and said he was just curious. He was thinking of switching phones. She thought about how thoroughly, carefully, methodically she had been used. He didn't just stand me up, she said. Her voice came out even. He engineered the whole thing, the app, the timeline, the restaurant, me. She paused. I was his infrastructure. Soren was looking at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity, nothing like pity, something more like the specific recognition you felt when a set of numbers finally resolved into a pattern. Get the extraction team, he said to Nico, not breaking eye contact with her. Tell them to be thorough. And the girl? Soren stood up. The girl, he said, stays. It took his technicians 18 minutes. Wren sat at the kitchen island, while 3 people she'd never met performed operations on her phone that she couldn't entirely follow, and drank a second glass of bourbon that she absolutely could follow. And by the end of it, they had extracted a file containing financial documentation for 14 months of redirected wire transfers, 3 offshore account registries, routing codes for 6 separate shell entities, and the full ledger of the Marchetti Network's East Coast operations. Information that Soren Vance clearly had not previously possessed, and that had a visibly significant effect on the emotional temperature of the room. Wren got her phone back with the file cleanly removed and her data otherwise untouched. At 1:40 in the morning her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at Soren. He gave her a single nod. She answered, Wren. Owen's voice was tight, slightly breathless, and arranged in the specific register of a man performing concern. Thank God, are you safe? I've been worried sick. Wren looked at the middle distance and felt the 6 weeks of morning texts move through her like something being metabolized. I'm at home, she said. Her voice came out very calm. The restaurant got evacuated, some kind of private event. I waited and waited, Owen. I was so worried about you. I'm so sorry. His voice shifted, smoothing out, getting warmer, the voice she'd trusted. There was an emergency. It's complicated. Listen, that file I sent you tonight, the menu file, I need you to bring your phone to me. Right now. Why? Is something wrong with it? A pause. The warmth dropped out of his voice, not gradually, but all at once, like a power outage. Wren, I don't have time to do this. I need that file. It's just trust me, okay? You trust me. I do trust you, she said, which was the last true statement she would ever make to him. Good. Then come to the parking structure on West 54th, level B2. Come alone. Don't tell anyone. Oh, and it's almost 2 in the morning. I'm scared. Stop. His voice was suddenly hard and ugly and entirely unfamiliar, stripped of everything that had made her think, for 6 weeks, that she was finally being seen by someone who deserved to see her. Stop being dramatic and do what I'm asking. You think any of this was real? You were useful. That's it. So be useful one more time and bring me the phone, or I promise you that the people I'm involved with will make the last month of your life look very different than it has been. Soren, who had been standing 3 feet away listening without expression, reached over and ended the call. The room was very quiet. Level B2 of the West 54th parking structure, Wren said. Her voice was entirely steady. The anger had burned down into something colder and more precise, the way fire sometimes does. Soren's face was a wall, a very still, very cold wall. He picked up his own phone and made a single call. Nico, West 54th, level B2, full detail. Then he looked at Wren. You don't have to come, he said. I know, Wren said and stood up. The parking structure smelled of damp concrete and engine oil. Her heels echoed on the decline to level B2, each one too loud and too precise. Soren had given her his coat, charcoal cashmere, warm and serious, smelling of cedar, and she wore it over the burgundy dress with the odd, anchored feeling of someone wearing borrowed armor. 30 feet, Soren said quietly from behind her. I'll be right there. She walked out of the stairwell and into the cold fluorescent light of B2. Owen Latimer was standing beside a concrete pillar, looking like a man who had aged 8 years since last Thursday. His suit was wrong, not the sleek put-together version of his profile photos, but something wrinkled and slightly damp, collar open. The particular dishevelment of someone who'd been moving fast and sleeping badly. He was holding a phone in one hand. Wren, he exhaled. Finally. Where is it? Wren stopped 10 feet from him. She had rehearsed something to say during the walk down, some precise and devastating sentence, and now that she was standing here, she found she didn't need it. She just looked at him. You spent 6 weeks, she said, making me feel like I was worth seeing. He stared at her. Wren, that's all I have to say to you. She put her hands in the coat pockets. I'm not going to spend energy on it. You don't deserve the effort. Owen's expression flickered. Then it went past confused and into something else. Something registered the moment he looked past her shoulder and understood what he was seeing. Soren Vance stepped into the fluorescent light. Behind him, emerging from the shadows of B2 like smoke taking form, 7 men in dark coats fanned out in a neat, unhurried arc. Owen went the color of old chalk. Mr. Latimer. Soren's voice in the concrete space was very quiet and entirely, devastatingly clear. He walked forward until he was standing beside Wren. His hand settled at the small of her back. Warm, steady, completely certain. You used my infrastructure. You stole from my organization. And you spent 6 weeks engineering harm to a woman who had nothing to do with any of it. Owen opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I don't care about the explanation, Soren said. Wren. She felt him look at her and she turned. His grey eyes in the cold light of that underground level were something she hadn't seen in them before. Not the flat calm of the restaurant. Not the calculating stillness of the penthouse. Something that lived underneath all of that, older and less controlled. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at Owen Latimer, at the man who had made her feel for 6 weeks like she was finally visible, who had spent 6 weeks building that specific feeling for no purpose other than to use it. "Handle it," she said. Soren nodded once. He looked at Nico, who was already moving. Owen started talking very fast, the way people do when they realize the last available moment is in the process of closing, but Ren had already turned away. She walked back toward the stairwell, Soren's coat around her shoulders, her heels quiet now on the concrete, and she did not look back. Soren caught up to her at the stairs. He walked beside her rather than behind her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I will be." She pushed the door open into the stairwell. The air was slightly warmer here. "I want my phone back." "You have it." "I want a receipt for the contents that were removed." He looked at her. "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "I document things." The pause that followed was the longest one he'd given anything she'd said. And then Soren Vance, who was 41 years old and ran a criminal organization, and had never in his adult life been told by anyone that he needed to produce paperwork, said, "I'll have Nico prepare one." Ren looked up at him in the stairwell light. "You could have told your men to deal with me at the restaurant," she said. "Written me off as collateral and moved on." "Yes. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality than it had had all night. Still measured, still carefully controlled, but with something under it that she could hear the way you heard a frequency rather than a sound. "Because you sat at that table for 2.5 hours and you didn't crumble," he said. "You got angry. And when you understood what had been done to you, you didn't waste a single second feeling sorry for yourself. You started moving." He looked at her. "I've worked with a great many dangerous people, Ms. Calloway. None of them had your particular kind of nerve." She held his gaze. "I want my receipt," she said, "and I want a car home." "Both," he said, "are already arranged." He held the door for her, and she walked through it, and behind them, somewhere in the cold concrete dark of level B2, Owen Latimer was learning something final and definitive about the cost of using the wrong woman. Ren Calloway stepped out onto the street. The city was cold and lit and permanent around her, and she walked forward into it with her shoulders back and the burgundy dress still on, and she did not look anything like a prop.